Hey, Panini, don't you be a... Welcome back, all you lovely... I have to enjoy myself while you're off with Mr. Green. So welcome back, all you lovely people. I did hope you enjoyed the lesson from Mr. Green. I think he does a good job with these. Getting us thinking about world poverty and Peter Singer's argument. I won't focus on the Garrett Hardin stuff. It's interesting, but I think Peter Singer is more than interesting enough for our purposes in this class. Now, when it comes to Mr. Green, I do think he focuses, because it's very attractive to focus on that example of the drowning child and what we should do. And, it's an example Singer uses, so it's not, but I do think we sometimes everyone likes to focus on that example, and the nature of Singer's argument is lost. So I want to flesh that out, because Singer does think his argument is pretty simple and pretty important. I mean, I can throw up the skeleton there. This argument doesn't have too many premises. And again, Singer doesn't think these premises are very controversial. And yet these premises are going to yield a very, very powerful conclusion. Namely, we can already, again, go back to that diagram. We can throw the conclusion up there now. Yeah, the conclusion is straightforward. He says, you are morally obligated to assist those in poverty. I mean, he's very clear on this point. So how is his argument? What's his argument justifying this? All right, well, let's walk through it. So I think if you look to page, right away, on page 231, you can see his first premise. This is where Singer says, suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care, these are bad. Well, I think that's not too controversial. I mean, so he's just saying, hey, these things, dying's bad. That kind of suffering's rough. And so we can apply this idea then to world poverty. And I think we can see him say this basic assumption that suffering and death from poverty are bad. And once again, I hope this is not very controversial, that it's suffering and death from poverty. Yeah, it sounds bad. Singer doesn't even bother justifying it. He thinks it's pretty obvious. So much for that first premise. So now I think we can get his second premise still on page 231, but in the next paragraph. This is where Peter Singer says, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. And so for reasons that will become apparent as we go through this module, I will call this the strong principle of preventing bad occurrences. That is, if it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, you ought morally to do it. And again, he thinks this principle seems pretty obvious. He doesn't think it's controversial. I mean, after all, he's not asking you to create, more good in the world, though maybe that's something important. That's not what he claims to be doing here. This isn't about creating more good in the world. This is simply about eliminating bad things, stopping bad things from happening. That's all. And so that's like his example of the drowning child in the pool that Mr. Green talks about, right? This is supposed to help just illustrate this simple idea that unless you would drown saving that child, then you should go in and save them. Again, if you can't swim and you'll drown, then of course don't. That's you making a comparable sacrifice to, drowning to the child who's already drowning. But that's the idea then, why he thinks this preventing bad things, he thinks is pretty obvious and non-controversial again. That if you can stop something bad from happening, yeah, you should. Unless the sacrifice, is worse than what's going on already. And now Singer never says this explicitly, I'm sure but he assumes it clearly, is that all of us are able to stop, you, me, Professor Gray, you, the student, we're all in some way have the ability to actually stop these bad things from poverty from happening. And so I think we see the closest, where he's kind of being explicit on this point on page 235. We can scroll down there to 235 where Peter Singer says, when we buy new clothes, not to keep ourselves warm, but to look well-dressed, we are not providing for any important need. We would not be sacrificing anything significant if we were to continue to wear our old clothes and give the money to famine relief. By doing so, we would be preventing another person from starving. And so again, he's saying, if people are in poverty, then, look, if Look, if you're in poverty, you don't have to help out. Maybe you do need clothes and other things to stay warm. In which case, Singer says, okay, we're not talking to you. He's talking to people who do have the means of some kind. But again, he would say, even if you think you're in poverty, you might say, like, are you really suffering as much as those people, say, in sub-Saharan Africa are suffering, where they're literally starving to death in places, or, having parasites, other things that are pretty rough, to say the least. Is that you, or are you still able to buy like the latest phone or a new computer or something that you don't need, but that you like to have? And so if Singer would say, look, if you're able to buy certain luxuries, you're really not as bad off as those people in Africa, say. And so again, if you could put off buying a new phone or seeing a movie, use that little extra money and just donate it to something like charity, like Oxfam or something. Then you can do something. Again, if you're spending money on non-necessities, well, that's something you can trim and donate and really make a big difference in someone's life. And so I think we can put this all together into an assumption that Singer is making. I'll just call it the unstated strong assumption that, it is in your power. That is you, the student, me, the professor. It's in your power to prevent the suffering and death from poverty from happening without you or your dependents suffering comparably as much as those in poverty suffer. Now, again, Singer is assuming that you don't live in poverty. So I'll just say this. I, Professor Gray, I am not living in poverty. I am, compared to, those in poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, I am doing insanely well. I'm doing great. So certainly Singer would say the argument that is made certainly applies to me. And he would say to you guys, watching this, you students, look, if you're able to afford, things that are luxuries, then this applies to you too, because you're doing comparatively way better than those people in sub-Saharan Africa, say. And that's it. There's his argument. These three premises going into that conclusion that you ought to donate. You ought to, do something to alleviate world poverty. And he thinks this argument is he says it explicitly. He says seems to be to him a very sound argument. So we can recall, I love his terminology. We get to keep using it. So, hey, cool. Again, so recall that soundness asks us to do two things. Asks us first, are the premises true? And then soundness asks, the second thing it asks is this argument logically valid? Those are the things that soundness has us check. So we can think now, okay, let's look at his argument. Are these premises all true? And Singer has said, already thinks none of these are controversial. And maybe at least there's nothing obviously wrong with any of these premises. They all seem to have their, power and truthfulness about them, veracity. I mean, again, the only one that might be questionable is whether you are able to help. That's dependent on each of our own personal circumstances. But like I said, this premise is certainly true for me, for Professor Gray. I am not in poverty, and I suspect most of you are not either, but I don't know. I won't judge. I don't know. But again, if you can afford luxuries, then you are not in poverty, Singer would say. So seems that the premises at least seem to be true. Is the argument valid? That is to say, now we got to remember our terminology. What does it mean for something to be valid? And so validity, recall, just has us assume, for the sake of argument, that the premises are true. Does the conclusion logically follow? Must the conclusion also be true? That's the idea. And so let's assume for the sake of argument that Singer's three premises are true. Does the conclusion then logically follow from these three premises? And again, the conclusion does seem to logically follow. I don't know if you've taken a logic class, but if you have, you've probably heard of the idea of modus ponens. And indeed, this argument seems to be a pretty logical, straightforward use of modus ponens. If you've never taken a logic course and that just sounds like gobbledygook to you, that's fine. It is funny, though. I have had a student who took logic from me years ago now, but every time I see him, he always goes, modus ponens, professor. He liked that phrase. It's kind of modus ponens. That sounds cool. What was I talking about? It seems this argument of Singer, we're going to throw it back up there. Singer seems to think this seems logically valid. If the premises are true, it seems the conclusion just has to follow. And I just mentioned as a side note, there is a rule of logic called modus ponens that seems to suggest that this is a pretty valid argument. And this, I think, is actually why people find this argument so frustrating, since it means that pretty much all of us should be doing something about global poverty. Again, all of us who are not ourselves in poverty ought to be doing something, donating at least something. Delay on buying a new suit. Oh, I love this jacket, even though I'm getting a little fat for it with COVID eating. It's got elbow patches. He would say, you can't see it there, boom. He would say, Peter Singer would say, look, Professor Gray, yeah, that's a really nice jacket, but don't buy any more until that one's literally falling apart. And you have too many. I don't wear the same thing every day. Singer would say, you could probably wear, maybe 2 jackets and that's it, donate the rest, whatever. He'd say again, but most of us aren't doing any of that. Most of us are enjoying luxuries, new TVs, new phones, new whatever, going to the movies. Well, not going to renting movies, I guess, off iTunes. We pay for a Netflix subscription. That's a luxury. You're not going to die without your Netflix and chill, though life will certainly be less exciting. But again, we look at this argument, throw it back up there. It's not clear where Singer is going wrong. And I'll just say this now because I'm going to say it again a million times. When people criticize Singer, Singer always says, hey, you critic, you naysayer, you can nay all you want, but not liking my conclusion is not a counter argument. Again, not liking the conclusion is not an argument. The onus, he says, is on the critic to find the flaw. So yeah, you don't like that conclusion? Then what's the problem? We've just said it seems valid and it seems the premises all seem to be true. If that's the case, then how could you avoid the conclusion? And like I said, it's hard to find the logic flaw, at least an obvious one, because like I said, this seems to be just modus ponens, a very simple logical rule here for the validity. So that if you think there's a problem, it's probably with one of the premises. And I'll throw the argument up one last time. I mean, it's worth pondering because it's so simple and yet so demanding. And we'll definitely see that by the end of this module, how demanding this is. But again, look at this argument. Does this mean that you and I, all your classmates, all of us, again, all of us who are not in poverty, does this mean we all need to start donating more money to charity? I know, it's wow. I'll let you ponder that question. And so take a little break. Why don't you take a stretch, walk around the block? No, I don't know. Maybe that's too far. Come back. No, no, let's stretch the legs. Think that. Should we be all doing more? Are we all letting the world down by allowing poverty to continue without doing something about it? So think about that. We'll come back and then I'll discuss some surprising implications that follow from Singer's argument. But hey, take that stretch first. Think, and I'll be back here in a moment.